This week on the Wheelhouse, the primaries, Iowa, New Hampshire, and beyond. For Connecticut Public, I'm Frankie Graziano. This is the Wheelhouse. It's a show that connects politics to the people. We got your weekly dose of politics in Connecticut and beyond right here. And later this hour, we're going to dive into Maine and Colorado's decisions to remove former President Donald Trump from the ballot under the insurrection clause of the 14th Amendment. But first, all eyes are on Iowa and New Hampshire this month. They're going to kick off the presidential race. The Democratic National Committee proposed a reordering of the calendar, with South Carolina's voters heading to the polls first instead of Iowa. Bit of a shakeup meant to empower black and other minority voters. South Carolina's racial demographics better reflect the diversity of the nation, of course, while Iowa and New Hampshire's electorates overwhelmingly white. But it appears that some traditions are hard to break. New Hampshire even has it written into their state law that they must go first in the primaries. We're going to dig into that and what it all means. With me now is somebody that's been on the front lines in Iowa, now moving back to the South to cover the presidential primaries all over the place for the New York Times, and also talking to us today, Maya King. Thank you so much for coming on the Wheelhouse this morning.
Hi, Frankie. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming on. We appreciate it so much. I know how busy you are right now.
It's a crazy time, but it's a fun time.
All right. So I want to know if you had any fun covering the spectacle in Iowa, or at least if you could paint the picture for our viewers of what this was like. We know that, or listeners rather, we know that people can caucus at firehouses, private homes, even stuff like that. So what was this whole experience like for you watching this?
So I spent caucus night at a high school in Grinnell, Iowa, which is about 50 miles east of the capital city, Des Moines. And it was sort of your classic Iowa caucus. There were multiple wards, which are just really just a way to describe kind of smaller subsets of these caucus sites. So picture your classic high school. There were some people gathered in the gym, some people gathered in the cafeteria, some people gathered in the band room, all just according to where they lived. And the thing about caucuses is that everyone is really, it's pretty close to home. So these are people who are going out, you know, with their next door neighbors or their children's friends' parents, or they're even, you know, people that they go to church with to caucus and cast a ballot for who they would like to support. People also had the chance to speak up on behalf of the candidates that they preferred. The results of the caucus site that I visited and spoke with folks at was pretty uniform. Donald Trump won pretty overwhelmingly, though Ron DeSantis did come in second at my caucus site. And I just can't understate or overstate rather how cold it was throughout my entire time in Iowa. On caucus night, I think we warmed up to -2 degrees. And so that had a real impact on people's willingness and ability to come on out. There were some people who were supporting former President Trump who said, absolutely, rain or shine, I'll walk over broken glass for the man, and you know, any cold weather won't stop me. And there were some people who said, I'm a Republican voter, but do not want to see him win again. And so I'm coming out to brave the elements to try to do my part to stop him. But that was to no avail. Donald Trump, as we saw on caucus night, the results were called as caucuses opened at 7:00. The results were called by 7:30. So it was a very decisive win for the former president, and the start of quite a bit of momentum for him heading now into New Hampshire.
Ron DeSantis finishing second, and then sort of in a close third to at least DeSantis was Nikki Haley with about 19% of the vote. Vivek Ramaswamy finished fourth, And Asa Hutchinson was under there as well. He's now out of the race, and so is Vivek Ramaswamy. But we are going to focus a little more on the horse racy stuff towards the end of this interview. I want to ask you a couple of questions. But, Maya, do you get the sense that there's this anxiety in Iowa? There's a guy I've seen a lot in local coverage and also national coverage named Jeff Kaufman. I'm sure you've heard of him, who runs the state party. And people are very excited for this tradition, obviously, in Iowa. But do you get the sense that they think that there might be a time where they don't go first anymore, where that's not a thing?
I have not heard any doubts on the Republican side as it relates to the order of the caucus. I think Iowans take very seriously their place in the caucus order, and also a bigger thing, or perhaps just as important to many people in Iowa, is just how much money and attention it does bring to the state. So it's not only the political implications here; it's the economic boost that the caucuses bring every 4 years with this influx of reporters, of national news anchors, of people who are even traveling just to observe, and of course the candidates and campaigns and staffers themselves.
Yeah, that guy Jeff Kaufman, who I was talking about, he spoke with NPR and said one selling point he wanted to make to the nation was that maybe there's a fifth grader or something like that in Iowa that may want to run for president one day. Very local thing, and obviously we're talking about national issues. And speaking of national, what's the argument for Iowa not going first, particularly on the Democratic side?
I think the biggest argument for Democrats against Iowa or New Hampshire going first is the demographic argument. These are overwhelmingly white states, very rural and very religious, and don't really reflect, in large part, the racial or ideological demographics in other parts of the state. That was one big reason why President Biden chose South Carolina, or wanted South Carolina to go first in the primary order, something that is happening on paper, but not necessarily in practice. New Hampshire is, of course, still holding its Democratic primary, even though it's not being recognized. And Iowa Democrats also held their primary, but the votes will not be announced until after South Carolina casts its votes.
So just going back to what you were saying about New Hampshire, it seems like the Democratic National Committee rebelling at least against what's happening in New Hampshire. As I understand it, people in New Hampshire, at least Democrats, may still be trying to vote in their primary, maybe still trying to hold their Democratic primary.
Yes, and they plan to, and will be writing in President Biden's name, or perhaps casting their ballot for the long shot candidates Dean Phillips and Marianne Williamson.
So how's the DNC reacting to that?
Well, they don't recognize the New Hampshire primary as its first in the nation, and have focused all of their energy, time, and money on South Carolina. I think there is a little bit of disappointment from some DNC members that New Hampshire would forge ahead with this primary. However, at the same time, again, I think they focused a lot of their attention and time now on what's going on South Carolina, even though I think it should be said this is a largely ceremonial primary. President Biden is running, relatively unopposed. There are other Democratic candidates, but they're not even registering in polls of the race in South Carolina. Most folks don't really know who they are. So there's not a ton of incentive for voters to go back out. They know who is going to win. But the larger point, I think, that Democrats and the DNC is trying to the message that they're trying to broadcast is one of their commitment to diversity and representation, and their really willingness or desire to combat a number of stories and a narrative that I think has started to form about Biden's softening support with Black voters.
I want to get into that, and I think we're going to spend a lot of time on that. I just want to button this conversation up. Anybody complaining about disenfranchisement in New Hampshire or anything like that? Is that a concern for the party or anything like that?
I have not heard of disenfranchisement, but it is clear that New Hampshire Democrats are pretty upset that the order of the states has been rearranged. Again, this is a political argument, of course. Going first has real value, and it shows that the party is prioritizing your voters. But again, it also brings, a big number of reporters and of campaigns and attention to your state that you might not otherwise see every 4 years. And I think that matters a lot to Democrats in New Hampshire, as it does to Democrats across the country.
All right, let's hone in on South Carolina and how people in the South, particularly black people, people of color, are feeling about the president. I want to set the scene a little bit. Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. I believe that you were there, Maya King, and there were a group of, I don't know if it was hecklers or advocates, protesters, whatever you want to call it, people not happy with how the president has been presidenting here in the last 4 years, after it's been widely known that black people delivered a victory for President Biden in the last election.
Yes, I would call them protesters. Emanuel AME holds really strong significance among South Carolinians, black and white. The shooting that took place there in 2015 really brought to the forefront to the forefront of the minds of many people, not just in South Carolina, but across the country, of the dangers and the real poison of white supremacy. But in South Carolina specifically, I think for Black voters and Black faith voters in particular, it holds real significance. And so President Biden has made a real cornerstone of his reelection message the fight to preserve democracy, but also all of the forces that threaten democracy, one of those forces being white supremacy. And so as he was speaking about a week and a half ago about the massacre, the killing that took place there in Charleston in 2015, a group of protesters interrupted him to say, essentially, if you care about the lives lost and the violence 8 years ago, you should care about the lives lost in Gaza, and called for an immediate ceasefire. Their yells and chants were quickly drowned out by chants within the church of 4 more years, that being 4 more years for Joe Biden's presidency. And it was just a really fascinating moment. One of the first times that the president has been challenged publicly for the war in Gaza and America's role in that war. And also, a real look at how many people are feeling in this very important state. South Carolina is not a battleground state. Also, I'll say that, I think former President Trump won that state by double digits in 2020 and would be expected to do so again. Any Republican presidential candidate will likely win the state decisively. But in the primary, it's meant to send a message to the rest of the country. And I think that the protesters there also wanted to be part of that message, to say this is not just about Black voters, racial violence domestically, but forcing the president to answer to the violence taking place abroad, particularly in Gaza right now.
You think this was more of a young versus old thing, or was it more of were people of color involved in this protest?
People of color were involved in this protest. This is an age. I think that. Well, I'll say this. I think that a number of young voters are particularly incensed about the war in Gaza, but it's not just young voters who are feeling this way. The protesters who were there, who went out and actually took the fight to the president, though, were young people. And I think that matches a trend that we're seeing across the country on college campuses, and just in more spaces where young people are. There's a lot more vocal antagonism against this administration as it relates to the war in Gaza, and also the president's larger record.
Focusing on South Carolina as we move forward, because I know that's something you're going to be paying attention to both on the Republican side and the Democrat side, at least in terms of President Joe Biden and whether or not he has support of people of color and other minorities as well. What do you think? What are we hearing from what's happening in the South and the voters that you talk to?
Sure. I spend a lot of time in Georgia and in South Carolina. And one thing that has really concerned the president's reelection campaign is his standing with Black voters in particular. Upwards of 90% of Black voters have always supported Democrats. That was the support that Hillary Clinton got in 2016 and Joe Biden again in 2020. And now it seems that support is softening to a point where maybe you could see, I don't want to get into numbers, but not necessarily Black voters looking to support former President Trump, though we have seen some data to indicate that some Black voters are, or at least interested in exploring that possibility. But the bigger issue is that Black voters may stay home, that they just aren't feeling as enthusiastic about this administration, that they feel that the promises the campaign made to them in 2020 were very empty and not delivered upon, and so would just rather sit this out. And because there's such a crucial constituency, I mean, this is something that the Biden campaign is trying to take very seriously. And I think that's why you see things like President Biden at a manual, not just in South Carolina, but sort of at the heartbeat of some of these issues. Kamala Harris, Vice President Harris, was in Myrtle Beach 2 days before President Biden was in Charleston to speak to a conference of Black church women. In about 2 weeks, President Biden will be back in South Carolina. The vice president was there just on Monday to commemorate Martin Luther King Jr. Day. So it's just very clear to me that there is a real emphasis on ginning up enthusiasm among Black voters, but just doing things, attending events and talking to people to make it really clear. I think that this campaign is trying to center and appeal to African Americans in the South, hoping that enthusiasm will spread to other parts of the country. And then the voters you talk to, what's one way that the Biden administration can act here going forward to show Black people that they see them? I mean, I think that is really the question, is what can they do to show that they see them, but also what can they do that will get them back out to the polls. And when I talk to voters, I think really what they want is more tangible, the feeling that they are heard, but also feeling that that their lives have improved under this administration. And so it's a messaging problem for the Biden campaign, but it's also a policy problem. I'll be looking to see in the next few months leading up to November what kinds of last minute policies or last stitch efforts this administration can try to make happen. That would possibly show Black voters, young voters, people of color that they really are seen and heard. I think it could be something on student loan debt. It could be something bigger on the environment. But I think it's going to be immediate. It's going to have to be immediate and also doable, which is really tough, of course. But that's just my sense of I think what would actually get people back out to the polls. Maya King, New York Times, thank you so much for coming on, especially when you're all over the country now, as it is trotting the United States, covering the primaries. Thank you so much, Maya, for coming on The Wheelhouse. Thank you for having me. Have a wonderful day and good luck covering the races here as we go. And The Wheelhouse continues after this break. This is The Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. As we continue to talk about presidential primaries, let's go to where there's one Tuesday, the Granite State. Maybe while we're there, we'll live free or die, or check out Mount Washington on the Cog Railway, or light off some fireworks in Storyland. No, don't do that. We shouldn't do that. Joining us now is someone who is locked in on what's happening in New Hampshire during the lead up to the polls. Dan Barrick, the news director at New Hampshire Public Radio, a great place where our good friends share content with us inside the New England News Collaborative. Good morning, Dan.
Morning, Frankie. How are you?
Good. Don't light off any fireworks in Storyland. That's a wonderful place for children.
Yeah, no, especially not in the winter. Yeah.
Especially not in the winter. That's right. It's probably closed. Join the conversation if you'd like. 888-720-9677. 888-720-9677. We're talking about New Hampshire's decision to go first, despite the DNC's reordering of the calendar, and that causing some issues. So what did you think of that conversation I just had with Maya and President Biden actually not being listed on the ballot? How's this all going to work?
Well, Maya my kind of give a really good summary. This is really the culmination of years, if not decades, of tension between many national Democrats and New Hampshire Democrats. Maya touched on some of the tension there, concern from national Democrats that New Hampshire's electorate is not representative of the rest of the nation, and increasingly not representative of where the party's base is. A more diverse, a younger electorate. But it's never really flared out into the public and with such impact as it had this cycle, where you had the DNC last year formally voting to put South Carolina at the front of the primary, and essentially, put on paper penalties for states that violate that. The potential that no delegates will be recognized from that state, that candidates who break that, who campaign in states that are violating the DNC's calendar will be sanctioned. But as we discussed, the local Democrats here have kind of gone ahead and kind of almost just pretended that's not happening. So we've got a write-in campaign underway for President Biden that, while its supporters are calling it, kind of a grassroots effort, it's got many of the most established senior Democrats in the state, former senior office holders, former party officials running it. It's got a super PAC that's got TV ads up and mailers. And their goal is twofold. One, they say that with President Biden just kind of out of the conversation in New Hampshire, he runs the risk of kind of starting the general election with one foot in a hole. And they want to get the local kind of organizing up and ready now, so that by the time the fall election comes around, it's a well-greased machine. They also claim that by kind of putting on a strong write-in effort, that they will show to the national party that New Hampshire, in fact, deserves its first of the nation status, that we have a strong, robust tradition of local politics and organizing and neighbors talking to neighbors about candidates. I don't know how well that argument will translate to the national party. There's been a lot of continued tension between national Democrats, the state Democratic Party, and in fact, even the New Hampshire Attorney General has accused the National Democratic Party of voter intimidation by trying to downplay the relevance of the primary here. So we'll see, after the votes are counted. I don't think the outcome of the write-in effort's in doubt. I feel pretty confident, based on what I've been seeing, that Joe Biden will win the primary via write-in. But what it means for the future of the primary is far from certain at this point.
So that could also mean that somebody could pick up a delegate here or something like that, like Marianne Williamson or Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Could they surprisingly win the primary somehow because of this write-in effort? Is that a possibility, or would it be Joe Biden the whole way through write-in?
It's possible. I just, the polling indicates that Joe Biden's almost certain to win the write-in effort. But both of them, both Marianne Williamson and Dean Phillips, are Dean essentially violating the DNC's mandate by campaigning in New Hampshire, by even putting their names on the ballot. They're ignoring the DNC's requirement that any candidates who campaign in what they're terming a rogue state like New Hampshire will essentially be cut out of the nomination process.
You talked about sanctions earlier. Could they lose delegates? What would these sanctions be?
Yeah, lose delegates. It's a bit of a moot point, just given that this primary is not terribly competitive. If it were an open primary, if we didn't have an incumbent president in Joe Biden, I think it'd be a lot, you'd see a lot sharper elbows. I think in some ways it's kind of academic, but what you're seeing is, the national party and the state party really locking horns in the most visible way, as long as I've been, covering politics here for over 20 years. And I just don't see this. I don't see the way that the national party and the Secretary of State here are kind of ignoring the DNC's fist pump, kind of pounding the table as really helping that relationship down the road for 2028 or beyond, and New Hampshire's effort to retain a kind of sanctioned place at the head of the nominating calendar for Democrats.
If you are following along and you pay attention to the great work that they do up there in New Hampshire at nhpr.org, you would see that they've done some coverage on a recent voter ID law that passed in New Hampshire. Can you tell us how that might impact proceedings here?
Yeah, so the write-in effort is definitely one thing that election workers are preparing for. A lot of write-in ballots means, a lot more kind of manual counting that needs to be done. The other is what you mentioned, a new voter ID law that it's been in effect for a couple special elections and municipal elections, but this is the first big election where it'll be in place. What this law requires, it affects only people who are showing up to register to vote at the polls. New Hampshire has same-day registration. You can show up at your local voting place on election day and register to vote. What this law says, if you don't have photo ID, New Hampshire does have a photo ID law, you essentially get a special ballot, what they're calling an affidavit ballot, that will be marked, numbered, and set aside. And if you don't, within 7 days of the election, provide photo ID to election officials, your ballot will essentially be removed from the pile and your vote will be tossed out. Your ballot will essentially be ripped up.
So this is sort of like a provisional ballot.
Exactly. So New Hampshire's never had these. So there is some, it affects a relatively small number of voters. It's, people showing up to register for the first time who don't have ID. We've had voter ID here for several cycles. So, theoretically, most potential voters know to bring a driver's license or something. But there may be some number of voters who are confused by this, who feel it's unfair, who have questions, who so there are some concerns about just the education component here, about people showing up to vote, being told that if they don't have ID, they're going to get a provisional ballot, and being told, that ballot will be tossed out if they don't bring their ID. So it's getting tested. Speaking of the DNC, they have brought a lawsuit in state court, basically challenging that law more with their eye towards the November election, saying that it unfairly, could disenfranchise certain populations. That case actually has its first hearing in court here in Concord tomorrow. So that's also playing out kind of in real time alongside the primary. So
I think we've established that Joe Biden, even through write-in campaign, should have an easy time in New Hampshire. But this it could be something, I don't know. I don't want to make anything of it if it's not true. But could this be something that impacts the Republican race? If it's close between Trump and Haley there, or maybe DeSantis somehow decides to go campaign in New Hampshire and pulls it out. I don't know. Is this something that could impact the final tally where you'd have to go back a few days later if some votes are thrown out? What do you think?
Potentially. I think the fact that, as I said, you're dealing with a relatively small number, slice of the electorate. Gotcha. But that is a possibility. We did a story about the first affidavit provisional ballot, and as far as the only one that was cast was in a municipal election last month or 2 months ago, and it did affect the vote tallies when they tossed out that ballot. Several candidates lost a vote. If it's a close outcome here, we wouldn't know that till a week after Election Day, though. So we're sort of in uncharted territory. I see that as unlikely, just given what the polling says about Trump's wide lead here. But it's certainly a possibility, if unlikely.
If nothing else, they'll say that those vote tallies are unofficial in New Hampshire, I would imagine, on primary day.
Yeah, I don't know what language they're going to use, official or unofficial, but there is the possibility for revision if given the provisional ballot law.
Big question I want to ask you here is, especially through the reporters that you are working with, what's the newsroom telling you about what people in New Hampshire are feeling at this moment?
I think if we had to summarize it, there is a great deal of anxiety across the electorate. There's a sense that, and you hear this right, left, and center of the political divide, that the country is somehow fraying at the seams, whether your concerns are about the future of our democratic institutions, whether it's about the possibility of a return of a Trump presidency for certain people who look back without great relish at that time. Big concerns about the economy, about cost of living and housing costs, especially among Republicans, concerns about the situation on the border, concerns about foreign policy and America's engagement in affairs like the Israel-Gaza war, the Ukraine war, but a great deal of concern, and I think a sense that not a lot of people are really excited about the potential for a Trump-Biden rematch. A sense that the country should really be turning a page and looking towards new candidates, fresh representatives. So a lot of primaries. You think back, a lot of voters are going out there to vote for something or in support of a candidate, and I think what we're hearing from a lot of folks is they're kind of making a calculated effort to kind of vote with a pit in their stomach, and which candidate or which ballot I cast can mitigate or address what I'm concerned about the future fraying of this country.
Terrific summation of what the people are thinking about in New Hampshire. So key as we are about 6 days away from the primary. How accurate has New Hampshire's primary been historically in determining who's going to be the next president, or at least the nominee from the party?
Yeah, it varies. The last two New Hampshire primaries were won by Bernie Sanders, who, as we know, is not sitting in the White House right now. On the Republican side, it tends to be a little bit more accurate. Donald Trump won in 2016 after losing in Iowa to Ted Cruz. I think, people in New Hampshire have moved away in recent years from saying, that we are the predictor and more that we winnow the field. And I think we'll certainly expect to see that on the Republican side. I think there's a big possibility if either Haley or DeSantis finishes in a distant third, that person would have a lot of explaining to do about how they have a path forward if Trump comes out with, big 50% or plus victories in New Hampshire and Iowa. So the electorate here also tends to, it often rewards kind of candidates who don't hew to their party's, their party line. As I mentioned, Sanders, Trump, John McCain. So a lot of it has to do with independents, who will certainly be a big factor on primary here. Those are voters who are not registered with a certain party, aren't necessarily more moderate, but tend to be a little bit more less hidebound by party ideology and how they draw their ballot. So that'll also play, kind of be a bit of a wild card here next week.
One thing that people like to talk about when New Hampshire comes up, and a good opportunity to talk about on the Wheelhouse here today, John Sununu saying Iowa picks corn and New Hampshire picks presidents. I'm sure that's a quote that you get a lot, especially when you talk to people outside of New Hampshire.
Yeah, it's part of the kind of New Hampshire self-mythologizing about the value of the primary. It's the kind of argument too that you hear, in going back to this fight between the local and national Democratic parties, that the state's voters have played a valuable role, that being a small state with relatively affordable media markets and engaged electorate, that the voters here do a better job kind of vetting the candidates. I think there's a good case to be made counter to that especially in this day and age where you have candidates like Trump, whose campaign style in New Hampshire has largely been like big mega rallies, very little direct contact with voters. Even the candidates on the trail here, other than him, Nikki Haley's held a lot of events. She's been around, but, not a lot of unscripted interaction with voters or local journalists. Same thing with Ron DeSantis. So the notion that, this stereotypical New Hampshire voter who says, I don't vote for somebody unless I've met them 4 times. I think that's less and less possible and less a realistic reflection of what campaigning in the New Hampshire primary really looks like.
But does this situation that we're talking about with the DNC and local Democrats in New Hampshire contribute to this anxiety that you say that people are having, especially with this great tradition that New Hampshire has around voting, as it were, not just with the primaries, but also with Dixwell Notch in the general election? Does it contribute to that anxiety? And then, I guess, is this largely a symbolic primary on the Democratic side?
You hear a little bit of that anxiety from Democrats if you go around, those who feel like this is a snub. But, there's a large share of Democrats. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but there has been polling here that a significant number of Democrats in New Hampshire agree with the argument made by many national Democrats that the electorate here is not reflective of the national electorate, that it's too white, that it's too old, that it's too affluent and educated to really reflect the national electorate and the national concerns. So, there hasn't been a widespread hand wringing there. But I think, yes, as I said earlier, this is in some ways a symbolic primary for the Democrats. The outcome's not that much in doubt. There was a question about how much support will Joe Biden get. But I think if we really want to know what the future of the Democratic presidential primary in New Hampshire is, we're going to have to wait till after 2024 and see, if we have a true open primary with a big field of non-incumbent candidates running, Does the DNC try and strip New Hampshire of its first in the nation status? Do the candidates show up anyway? Do they still campaign here? That's always a big question. The DNC can do what it wants, but if the candidates show up and try and win New Hampshire voters, there's still going to be a primary that is meaningful. If the candidates sit out and heed the DNC's call to skip New Hampshire, then that will be another symbolic primary and a more meaningful reflection, especially if we have an open primary where no candidates show up. That will be a much bigger change in the trajectory of this history here. Really quickly, in the last 30 seconds or so that we're talking here, what's your primary night going to look like, Dan, and where your reporter's going to be? We'll have reporters at all the major camps. We'll have reporters with Trump, DeSantis, Haley. We'll have somebody with the Democrats. But most importantly, we'll be talking to a lot of voters. We'll have reporters out in the field, polling places, talking to voters, election workers. Really want to see how this primary is executed, if our election system is ready to kind of handle this every 4 years, and just what's on voters' mind, who shows up, and what they're voting for. Thank you so much. We'll have folks know that if they want to pay attention to this coverage, we'll be sharing it as well. But go to nhpr.org if you're interested in some of this great coverage of the New Hampshire presidential primaries. Dan Barrick, the news director for New Hampshire Public Radio, thank you so much for coming on The Wheelhouse. Thanks, Frankie. Take care. This is The Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. You want to join the conversation? Next, we're going to talk about whether or not former President Donald Trump should be on the ballot next time around. Call 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. This is The Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. We're going to move now from caucuses and primaries to another developing situation with major implications for the 2024 presidential election. We're talking about the U.S. Supreme Court's decision to hear Donald Trump's appeal of Colorado's decision to remove him from their primary ballot. Arguments will be heard beginning on February 8th. Joining me now, he returns to the Wheelhouse, Bruce Ackerman, Sterling Professor of Law and Political Science at Yale University and the author of the book Revolutionary Constitutions. Bruce, thank you so much for coming on the program this morning.
It's a pleasure. How are you?
I'm doing well. And if folks want to talk to us, they can call us at 888-720-9677. Bruce, can you help us with the heart of Colorado's case against Donald Trump being on the ballot and why it's important?
Well, the heart of the case is the actual explicit confrontation by the framers of the 14th Amendment, which is the foundation of our law. The equal protection guarantees equal protection. It's the foundation of our law. Section 3 confronts the problem of the Jefferson Davis. And Jefferson Davis, before he was president of the Confederacy, was a senator from Mississippi. And he swore to uphold the Constitution of the United States and then repudiated it by becoming president of the Confederacy. When he was captured, he was going to be executed for high treason. No, said the framers of the 14th Amendment. And here, these are radical egalitarians who are going to free the slaves and all of this. No, they'll just make him a martyr. He can live as a citizen, but he can but he and all the other traitors to the Republic who have engaged in an insurrection or rebellion or have assisted them, given them aid and comfort, shall be disqualified from any office, civil or military. This was enforced. Jefferson Davis could not run. Congress has the right, by 2/3 vote, to remove this disqualification. But they never did for Jefferson Davis.
And now we're connecting Jefferson Davis to the insurrection of January 6th. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And it is a paradigmatic act of insurrection to disrupt the peaceful transition of power. That's central to democracy. When you lose, and you have to give up power. Instead, we had the Proud Boys with everyone saw it. Then President Trump giving, in the words of the Constitution, aid and comfort to them, invading. If they had found Mike Pence, they would have perhaps killed him. We don't know. This is a paradigmatic act of insurrection. And that's why this is a challenge. The case from Colorado not only is a challenge to the legitimacy of Donald Trump, but to the legitimacy of the Supreme Court.
And when we factor in the Supreme Court's decision here, hearing arguments on February 8th, what should we expect from the Supreme Court here as they have to really go through this with a fine-tooth comb to try to think about this issue?
Well, I'm acquainted with most of the judges on the Supreme Court. They are serious people. The three Trump appointees are serious judges who are originalists. That is why they stripped women of their control over their body, because they didn't find anything on the original understanding that authorized Roe against Wade. I disagreed with that, but that's neither here nor there. I'm not interested in my own views. I'm trying to give you the basic foundations here, rather than. But this case is a test of originalism for these three judges. If these three judges decide that, despite the clear and overwhelming, this is not me, it's a host of thoughtful and serious academics and former judges, all who are conservative, all agree that this is a paradigmatic case of disqualification for Mr. Trump. If they instead say, no, I'm going to be a rubber stamp for the president who appointed me to office, they will discredit the Supreme Court.
Is there any way that there could be some kind of abstention or something like that if there is this perceived kind of conflict of interest?
Well, it isn't a conflict of interest.
Gotcha.
It's a conflict of principle. You see, I'm not saying at all. These three justices are people of integrity. That's their problem, that they're people of integrity, and they see this. Moreover, Chief Justice Roberts, has dedicated his entire career to preserving the legitimacy of the court as a forum of principle. And he, I'm sure, will be very concerned, especially given Roe against Wade, which has had such a devastating impact on the public reception of the court, if it is followed by saying, oh, yes, we're originalists so far as stripping women of their rights over their own bodies, but we're not originalists so far as stripping President Trump, Mr. Trump, of his candidacy. And moreover, keep in mind, if the Supreme Court makes this decision, it will then be up to Congress to decide whether Trump should continue to run. Now, the crucial thing, though, to keep in mind is that if the court operates as a matter of principle, and all that Justice Roberts needs, Chief Justice Roberts needs, is to convince one of the three Trump appointees to go with the three other more liberal appointees to the Supreme Court, and you'll have a 5-4 decision disqualifying Trump. And then, of course, if one goes, then probably the others will also swing too. So you might have a 7-2 decision, or maybe even a unanimous decision disqualifying Trump. What you have to do is, and what the Supreme Court will be asked to do, and I'm elaborating this in an article that's going to come out in Politico in a few days. What the Supreme Court is going to be asked to do is to stop the Super Tuesday and defer it for 6 weeks or 8 weeks until the beginning of June, or I'm sorry, May, and have the primaries and give other candidates a chance to enter the race, because of course once Trump is disqualified, then a number of younger 60-year-old, 55-year-old new generation candidates will enter the race.
Bruce, we have just about 90 seconds or so left, so I just want to kind of understand here. A lot of pundits talk about what's good for the country, and they're worried about a situation that you just outlined with Super Tuesday being deferred, or at least, maybe Trump supporters lash out against a decision like this. Talk about what's good for the country versus the rule of law and this principle standard that you talk about. How should the justices rule here as they look forward? Should they consider these things?
The Constitution is the supreme law of the land. If we do we have a constitution, a written constitution, or not? This is a fundamental question of principle. And second, if the rising generation of candidates on the Republican side come into the race, well, President Biden will have to reconsider whether he should not resign, but withdraw from the second term and allow a new generation of Democratic candidates to enter the race during this 6-week period, and leading candidates will, and then we will have a rejuvenated Democratic life in which we won't hear the same old charges on both sides, but a new generation from the Republican Party and the Democratic Party trying to appeal to the American people. And whichever about the future, not the past.
Colorado and Maine aggressive in taking this issue on. Connecticut's Secretary of the State, they tried to explore a way forward with attorneys, but said they'll see what SCOTUS says now, as will many other states. Bruce Ackerman will be watching this, and he's paying attention to this in Politico, so you should be paying attention to that article, politico.org, when it comes out. Thank you so much, Bruce.
Well, thank you.
Today's show co-produced by Chloe Wynn and Meg Dalton. Technical producer is Kat Pastor. Thank you so much, Tess Terrible, for helping us in studio, and thank you for helping us out, the real MVP, as we say. Download the Wheelhouse anytime on your favorite podcast app. I'm Frankie Graziano. This is the Wheelhouse. Thank you for listening.